With this first output on the screen, before we dig deeper into this app and build something more beautiful, let me take a step back and go back to Dart, because it's so important that you also understand Dart whilst we are working on this. For one, let me go back to Material App and Text. I mentioned that these are not functions, but classes. And yet, I pass some data to them, right? I pass the hello string to text, and I even have this more strange looking home : thing here for Material App. Let's go back to our little Dart example here on Dartpad, which we started working on earlier. There we also have person, and person has some default values here. Now we can override these defaults, but what if our class should be a bit more generic? For example, for a person, it doesn't really make sense that the default would be max and 30. If we're, for example, building an application where users can sign up, then why would we assume that the average user is named Max? That does not make any sense. So you might want a setup where you have no initial values, but instead, when this class gets created, we can pass the initial values here between the parentheses. So that I have Max and 30 here, and I have Manu and 31 here. And then I don't need to overwrite my name down there. That would be nice, but right now it's not supported. We can support it by adding a so-called constructor to this class. A constructor is a function inside of a class, and therefore we could also call it a method, because functions inside of classes are methods. It's just a different name. It's a function inside of a class which is different to other functions inside of the class in that it always executes only once when we create a new object based on the class, which happens when we call a class like this. You add a constructor by repeating the name of the class. So in this case, person, like that. In other programming languages, you would write constructor, for example, but in Dart, it's really just the name repeated. You add parentheses, like for a normal function, and then you add curly braces, which holds the code that should run when this class gets created. Now here, you can accept arguments, like name and like age, or input name and input age to avoid confusion with the names we chose up there. Though you could use the same names, because Dart also has a feature called scoping, which means that if you had the same names as up here in the arguments, it would not overwrite this or anything like that. Instead, it would simply just create new variables inside of person. It always creates new variables for every argument you get, and these variables could have the same name and they would not clash, because Dart would, behind the scenes, manage that separation between your class level variables and your function or constructor level variables. But here, to not confuse you, I chose different names. And now inside of the constructor body, we could refer to our name up here by just typing name and assigning input name as a value, and the same for the age. Now, by the way, if you had the same name, so let's say I had age here, then of course Dart would not be able to figure out if we mean the age up here or the age here when we're using age in the body of the constructor, and therefore it gives us a special this keyword which refers to the class itself, and with this.age we can tell Dart that here I want to refer to the class level age variable, whereas without this I want to refer to the function or constructor level variable. So this is the code we can use. We could do the same for name, just want to show the two different options. And now with that, we have a constructor which allows us to create our object, if I run this, with different default values down there, which is of course pretty convenient and a feature you'll use quite a lot. That's also the feature text uses here, which accepts a string which we can pass to the constructor, which we will use to output something, because having a default text in the text class would not make that much sense. Now, besides using this syntax here, you can also use named arguments. And that means that you simply wrap that here in curly braces. Now what this does is, it means that now these arguments are all optional, and therefore of course you should write code that can live with no values being provided, and that you do target them by name when you're creating your data. So here you would then target a argument by name by repeating its name here when you create an instance based on that object, like this. Input name colon, and also age colon. That concept of named arguments is also not only available for constructors, but also for normal functions. Now, if we repeat this, it still works. Now, why would I use named arguments? It's especially great for constructors or functions that take a lot of arguments, because if you have normal, positional, so non-named arguments, you have to remember which argument goes into which position, that the name is the first and the age is the second argument. Now, obviously, for a constructor with 2 arguments, that is doable, but if you had 10 arguments, it would be more difficult. By using named arguments, you can simply use the name to assign it, and you can also mix and match the order here if you wanted to. So here I could first assign the age and then the name, because I'm targeting it with the name, right? So with the name of the argument. And therefore, the order doesn't matter here. For positional arguments, as the name suggests, it does matter. Now, since I mentioned that all named arguments automatically are also optional, you also should either define default values here with an equal sign right in here in the argument list. That's something you can do. Now, in case you don't provide an age, the default value would be used, and that can of course be useful to avoid that your code breaks. Or you add a special annotation, the add required annotation, which will ensure that the compiler yells at you if you don't provide a value for that named argument. So with that, you turn that optional named argument back into a required one. Now, side note, required is not a feature built into Dart, and therefore here I get an error that Dart doesn't understand what add required means, but it will be built into Flutter, so here we will be able to use that. And with that, it's hopefully a bit clearer what named arguments are and what constructors are. Now, one last side note, if I remove add required here, one last side note because it is important, let me add the default value again. Sometimes this setup here, where you get certain data and you want to assign it to variables of your class, is so common that you don't have to write all that code. Instead, you can get rid of your constructor body, add a semicolon after it, and now just make sure that you use your variable or your property names up here, so that you use name and age. And now, here, you can simply target this age, and here also this name, now without a type assignment, because we got the types here already. And this is a shortcut understood by Dart, which tells Dart, okay, what we receive as a name argument will be stored in a name property. What I receive as an age argument will be stored in the age property. And now, since I renamed this to name again, because now the names here have to match, since I renamed this to name, I also have to rename it down there, of course. And now this works again, and it's of course shorter than writing that extra function body for the constructor.